think that this is an energy expansion, not just an energy transition, meaning instead of just focusing on what we want, let's focus on the entire picture. And that includes being really honest about what those consequences, even if they're unintended, look like. And then from there, work backwards on essentially like, well, what energy mix makes the most sense? Because it is all, and we'll talk about this, it is an all of the above set of solutions. It's not just one or the other. It's not mutually exclusive. It's an expansion.
Welcome to Lightbulb Moments, a video podcast series brought to you by Mitsubishi Power. We're bringing you the brightest minds, most engaging stories, and illuminating points of view from across the power sector. I'm your host, Erin Bordelon. Today, I have the privilege of talking to Dan Romito from Pickering Energy Partners. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Appreciate you having me. Thank you.
In one of your publications, you wrote that the market is asking the wrong questions when it comes to energy transition. And so I wanted to start there. What are these wrong questions and what are the right ones? How can we correct the course?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times what ends up happening with energy discussions is we set out, especially from a policy perspective, like what we want to happen. As terrible as it sounds, you have to eliminate the vast majority of emotion in the discussion. It is a very emotionally charged topic for a variety of different reasons. So I'm not saying that you just focus entirely on the spreadsheet, but right now the balance is 80% emotional, 20% data. We need to reverse that. And what we should be focusing on is like, what does the world look like in 20, 50, 100 years? And one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is how much power is actually going to be there. Now, in many ways, obviously it's an unfair question because your crystal ball is as good as mine. But we have a variety of economic, geopolitical, socioeconomic catalysts that are telling us that we're going to need double or even in some scenarios triple the amount of power. So first things first is just how much power are we going to require and what are the various energy mixes that get us there or accomplishes or addresses those goals that have the least amount of negative externalities. That's another thing that we just don't talk about is the negative externalities. We were like, oh, for example, wind and solar, no negative externalities. Well,
Right.
That's not the case.
Right.
Oil and gas, 100% negative externalities. Well, that's not the case either.
Yeah. So can we explore those negative externalities a little bit? What are some of those in those instances you just gave, and why do you think oftentimes those are kind of the afterthoughts to what we should be doing, right? We let policy lead. We let here's our need. Here's how we're going to meet the demand. Here's how policy can help us get there. And then kind of as a footnote, it feels like and we should do it in a just and equitable way, right?
Yeah.
So how do you balance all that?
Yeah, I think, first things first, like none of the answers are simple, right? So to oversimplify this stuff or to go in with the assumption that it's going to be simple and just you're going to be able to do it, no.
Yeah.
Right? Now, full disclosure, like my largest personal holding is in an electrification company. So I like to joke that like my kids are going to community college or Harvard based on like what the performance of this electrification company is going to do. So I'm not trying to sound like a fossil fuel apologist, but I am a realist in the sense that, there are problems with the oil and gas industry, and everyone for the most part, or reasonable minds, acknowledge that. But on the wind and solar thing, even though at a high level it sounds great, 60 to 70% of the supply chain is overseas. Most of it is with China.
Yeah.
Now, we have case study on what happens when your supply chain overly relies on China. Forget for a second the geopolitical strains and all that other jazz that goes along with it. You don't want the vast majority of supply chain with a foreign competitor, especially one that has adversarial tendencies like China. The other component is that wind and solar just take up a lot of space. So we live in Florida. If you go to Northeast Florida, you're seeing trees and forests being chopped down and replace them with solar farms. Like,
Yeah.
that doesn't make any sense either. Instead of just focusing on what we want, let's focus on the entire picture. And that includes being really honest about what those consequences, even if they're unintended, look like. And then from there, work backwards on essentially like, well, what energy mix makes the most sense? Because it is all, and we'll talk about this, it is an all of the above set of solutions. It's not just one or the other. It's not mutually exclusive. It's an expansion.
I do think it's funny that, you bring up this whole concept of good versus evil within this space, which we see time and time again, and it gets in our own way. But I think it's our natural predisposition as people, right? This is what we want to do. We want to storytell. We want heroes and villains. And part of the challenge is overcoming the emotional barrier, as you're saying, and coming to an understanding of, okay, here's the rhetoric. How does it align with what needs to happen in the next 10, 20 years?
The running joke for me is like when I go in to an oil and gas board meeting, it's like, oh God, like here's Romito. He's gonna, chain himself to a tree and he's wearing Birkenstocks. And it's like, not really. And then when I go to like an environmentalist group, it's like, there's that nut job, drill baby drill, let's blow everything up and like, let's just have geysers of oil flow everywhere. You're like, no, like that's not. There is this optimal balance that exists. And I think the general public is actually been done a disservice because opposite ends of the spectrum convey just what they want them to know to better support their argument. What's sometimes crazy is like the stuff is already in place. Like we have precedent and we have case study going on. Like if you see what's happening in Virginia, for example. So Virginia in many ways is considered data center alley. They control about 70% of the world's internet traffic. You have a vast amount of data centers.
70% of the world's internet
70% of the world's internet traffic goes through the data centers that are located in Virginia. So when we did our publication, it's like, oh, okay, well, if so much internet traffic is going through Virginia, how are they powering that? Virginia is 60% natural gas, 30% nuclear, right? So the idea is that if we're going to have this expansive economic opportunity brought upon us by generative AI, we don't have to ask, well, what do we have to do? In many ways, we're already doing it, right? I've had conversations with people in Illinois who hate nuclear, and you're like, 30% of Illinois' energy mix is nuclear. So I think a lot of it has to do with, to your point, is it's emotionally charged and in many ways that drowns out what is actually going on. Like most of these things aren't hypothetical or aspirational considerations. It's going on right now and people just don't necessarily know about it.
So a couple of things to touch on there then. In that energy mix that you just described, it's not dissimilar to what the national energy mix is, right? So I have in 2023, 4.2 trillion kilowatt hours of electricity. 43% of that was from natural gas and 19% was from nuclear. So that seems proportionate to what you had just kind of gone over, but does that scale the same way?
The big delta is that Virginia is using half the amount of renewables that the national average is. Now, once again, there's some regional aspects of that, right? It's different in Florida than it would be in Pittsburgh. No offense, Pittsburgh. Right? It's a little bit cloudier there. The other component too is the economics. Virginia's energy mix, at least for that center, that area, is 30% cheaper than the national average. So you have like these little nuances where they use half the amount of renewables. They're still using 10%, right? And that could grow. Like it depends on how we scale renewables associated and the cost curve associated with that. But the bigger thing is, I think a lot of businesses and a lot of economic activity saying, oh, you can facilitate our power demands and you can do it cheaper, 30% cheaper than what the national average displays. Once again, people don't really know that. And we'll talk about this. They're able to decarbonize, right? Natural gas is a cleaner, more effective, more efficient fuel source than, let's say, coal. And then nuclear is nuclear. But you can have your cake and eat it too. We have very affordable, very reliable, very efficient energy that drives economic activity, which obviously drives jobs and all that stuff that goes along with it. But when you bring up those statistics, the people who don't like oil and gas, like, they just don't want to hear it.
Because that is the undercurrent through all of this. We have to meet demand, we have to do it equitably, and we have to make money.
Right.
We have to keep jobs afloat.
Yeah.
We have to retain economic dominance on a global scale. And so balancing all of those things.
There's also this dissonance going on, because if you went to someone on the south side of Chicago and said, please tell me about climate change, they would say something like, I don't care, just trying to pay my bills, right? If you went to like the boarding school on the Northeast with the kids ready to go to like an Ivy League school, and you say, please tell me about climate change, you're going to get a 7-hour dissertation on like the evils of oil and gas. So there's like these competing interests, and you put it best. It's, you have to instill economic security first. Like without economic security, you don't have the capital, you don't have the people, you don't have the innovation, and then environmental stewardship can come. So I get where people are coming from, but at the same time, you just can't say we're going to eliminate oil and gas. There's all these unintended consequences associated with that decision.
Right. Yes. So one thing I think we can marry here is the rhetoric between decarbonization and net zero. And so connect some of those dots for me. What's the difference between net zero versus decarbonization? Why are they conflated to be this kind of same thing?
Yeah, it's one of the, once again, nuances, right? It's this frustrating dynamic where people think that net zero is decarbonization, as you outlined, and it's not. It's actually completely different. Decarbonization implies the pursuit of net zero, which carries economic incentives. Absolute net zero is, for all intents and purposes, frankly, a pipe dream. You cannot attain net zero without reducing economic output. And when you reduce economic output, the people who are going to suffer or tend to suffer the most are the people who can least afford it. Do people in Southeast Asia, Western Africa, Eastern Europe, do they want net zero? Absolutely not. They want electricity. They want access to water, right? They want air conditioning, right? They want all the modern luxuries that we take for granted. And you're not going to provide them with that opportunity if we go net zero.
It is an interesting privilege to consider net zero because it assumes that we're all in the same part of the energy transition, and which is what you're saying, right? So we've had the opportunity to use coal and then wean off of it, right? Sustain the economic and societal development that parallels that. Other parts of the world haven't had that. To then just assume that they are ready for net zero and that net zero would be fair to them. It's a privileged point of view in some ways.
Yeah, it's one of those things that sounds amazing on the surface, on paper.
And that's why it's catchy.
Let's go net zero.
Net zero.
You're like, yeah, that sounds amazing. Let's totally do it. Like, I'm in. And then you're like, wait a second. You want the United States to go to, let's take a friendlier country. Let's take India, for example. You cannot improve your standard of living because we don't want you to increase your reliance on coal. We don't necessarily want you to increase natural gas. We want you to go to wind and solar, even though you don't have the infrastructure to do it. And by the way, spend a couple $1 trillion building that infrastructure. They're going to be like, no. No, we're not doing that. We're absolutely not doing that. So it's not even really in a debate. It's other countries, mostly developed countries, India being a great example, want to experience their own industrial revolution, right? And so in the simplest of terms. And I don't really think any country, let alone the United States, has the moral authority to say, no, you can't do that. What you can do is the United States over the last 40, 45 years has simultaneously increased economic output. So if you measure economic output by GDP per capita, and then you measure emissions impact by consumption-based and production-based CO2 per capita, you see this vast divergence between the two in the United States. It's not even relegated to the US. That's Germany, that's the UK. I mean, that's a little bit of Canada, but predominantly the US has increased economic output while simultaneously reducing emissions. So back to my point on blueprint and case study, we have that in place. So you could figure out a way to help those respective economies adopt the innovation and the technology, frankly, the capabilities that we have, because we've done it. And then when you go to someone who might not be as friendly to the oil and gas space, or someone that's net zero, and you're like, we are decarbonizing. Like
Yeah.
that is taking place. We're just not doing it with sacrificing economic output. They either don't believe the data, or if you give them credit, they're astounded because they think that we're just shooting emissions
Right.
straight up, and we're not.
Right.
We're not.
So I will pause here and explain real quick. When you say the data, what do you mean? What are you referring to? Where do you get your data? Where can people find it, et cetera?
So there's a variety of great sources. We don't use like Dan's proprietary data that
Sure.
I create in like in the garage, so to speak. EIA has great data. IEA, our federal government has great data sources. There's Statista, right? You just go on statista.com and they have immaculate data sets that they just aggregate across the place. So this is all readily available. It's even to the point now where my kids will use Copilot or Chat GPT because now that my 12-year-old thinks that everything I say is borderline ridiculous,
Right.
so like double check my work.
Right.
So it's all readily available. I think the problem is, back to your original question, is we anchor ourselves to the answers that we want, and then we just seek tidbits of information and data points that would confirm what the conclusion we are desiring or what we're seeking, and then we get in this mix of just like arguing. There is no point to argue climate change. It is an emotionally based argument. You're not going to convince someone who thinks it's a thing that it's not a thing, and you're not going to convince someone who thinks it's not a thing that it is a thing. That is just a complete waste of time. And once again, I'm not a meteorologist. I'm not a scientist. I'm not here to say what I am here is there are trends in the market. The first one is the market, generally speaking, wants to decarbonize. And once again, there's motivations that are economically based and there's motivations that are environmentally based. My thing is like, who cares?
Right. The end result is
yeah,
the pursuit is the same.
The pursuit is the same. The end result is the same. Who cares about like how the sausage is made? So we like to say that the pursuit of net zero, there's economic incentive in that. And that economic incentive eventually leads to greater environmental stewardship. The other component too is a lot of people are realizing that yes, emissions is a concern and emissions should be a focus, but it's not the only focus, right? When you look at the state of water and you look at the state of waste, those represent much more imminent threats. And when I say we should be focusing on water, that doesn't imply that we ignore emissions, right? Once again, in the spirit of an all of the above set of solutions, it's an all of the above set of considerations. But keep in mind, when we have these conversations, we tend to ignore a lot of the other geopolitical or socioeconomic catalysts that are taking place right now. So for example, we are reshoring semiconductor chips to the United States, as we should. What doesn't necessarily make sense is where they're putting these facilities in the United States. The vast majority of them are in Arizona, California, basically the southwest portion of the United States. And just simple statistics, you have some estimates saying that Arizona just experienced its worst drought in 1,200 years, 1,200 years. That's a long time. California just got over a drought that lasted 3.5 years. You have the halt of agricultural production in Arizona because of water issues. And so what people don't necessarily realize is how water intensive semiconductor chips are. Like one semiconductor chip requires about 2,200 gallons of water. One. Wow. In EVs, those cars have about 3,000 semiconductor chips. So it's like you figure this out and you're like, California just mandated that everyone goes EV. Fine, we can talk about that later. They don't have the infrastructure for that, by the way, because about a quarter of all the U.S. power outages take place in California today. But in a place that is drastically known for dealing with drought, they're reshoring semiconductor facilities that is, if not the most water-intensive business, at least one of them.
One of them, yeah.
So it's like, well, we have these things in the Midwest called the Great Lakes. Like, they have a lot of water in the Great Lakes. Like, why did they lose out on this opportunity?
So why did they?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I have no idea. It's a head scratcher. It's like, what the hell am I missing here? Why did you do that? But in any case, theoretically, if emissions got worse, which they're not, but if they did, we'd have a normal life like
Yeah.
for the foreseeable future. It wouldn't be great, but I'm not endorsing we do that. But the water issue is so much more imminent and so much more impactful to not necessarily just environmental considerations,
but immediate quality of life.
Economic, immediate quality of life, socioeconomic, geopolitical, all of the above. Look, I mean, cynically, there's a lot of political capital associated with emissions. I totally get it. You can run an entire campaign today on net zero. You can run an entire campaign on, eliminating the oil and gas industry.
Right.
I think water, to your point earlier, is one of those things that we just take for granted. Like if you look at the state of water in Western Africa, Southeast Asia, even to some degree like Eastern Europe, it's not great. And so same thing, like we turn on the lights and you're like, oh, the light turns on, or you like turn on your sink and the water comes. Like that is not something that just happens immediately in other parts of the world. Like something like almost 20% of the world, I actually think it's 16%, but it's 16 to 20 depending on who you talk to. They don't have just electricity.
Right.
They just don't have that. And so, if we look at the United States as like this blueprint, obviously we're not going to go back to the days of like the kerosene lamp, but we relied on coal extensively for a very long time. And now we still have coal in the energy mix, but we've actually figured out how to decarbonize our energy mix, namely with natural gas and nuclear.
Sure.
So the trick is, how do you provide other countries seeking to go through their own, as I said, their industrial revolution, whatever you want to call it. It's not just emissions, because they're not going to care, right? They're not going to care. What they probably will care about is water. The other one is waste. Do you know how much how much waste?
I don't want to know.
Yeah. So we did this. We extrapolated this out. It's on average, the globe, the collective we throw away about 70 million metric tons of cell phones per year. Wow. So it's not just let's fix the emissions program. There's other imminent threats that could really destabilize not necessarily the United States, but the globe. Can you imagine a global water shortage?
Right.
Like, who is that going to impact? Once again, the people who can least afford it.
Right.
Like, where are we going to put all our cell phone waste?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think Indonesia is going to continue to just say, give us your garbage, guys. Like, that's not going to happen.
Which alludes to something we've kind of danced around when we talk about industrial revolutions and such. I mean, we're time for another. We're due for another one, right? Like, in the sense that we need a infrastructure shift in our relationship with energy, how we're using energy, how we're considering it, and all the other things too, the social parameters that go along with the Industrial Revolution.
I mean, the last time the United States meaningfully invested in infrastructure was in the late 60s.
Yeah.
Like, it's been a while.
Yeah.
Right? There's a lot of gray hair in the infrastructure, as we like to say. And so once again, people are like, well, let's just decarbonize. It's like, well, there's all these other ancillary things you have to consider. And then when you even get into the nuances of like, hey, Texas is on a different power grid than the Northeast.
They get their
people
own.
Are like, right, what is this black magic you're laying upon me? It's like, no, like you have to understand first and foremost the foundational tenets of how we get our power. And once you understand that, you understand there's a complexity there, which doesn't mean we should not do it.
Right.
But what it does mean is that you have to be very, very thoughtful about it, because number one, it's regionally based. Like, what works in Texas doesn't work in Massachusetts, which works in Florida doesn't work in, Nevada, or I don't know. I mean, some example like that. But the other component too is who pays for it. For the time being and for the foreseeable future, reasonably speaking, there is an inflationary pressure with renewables, which does not mean we don't pursue it, but it does mean that we have to be more realistic with their adoption rate, right? If you look at California, like, I will pick on them. They have the second highest electricity rates in the United States. Hawaii has the first. Relative to the national average, California's electricity is 90% more expensive. Now, for people in like Beverly Hills or Santa Monica or Silicon Valley, do you notice what you pay in electricity monthly?
Right.
Like, probably not. For the single mom or for just the normal lower middle class people, like, I would imagine that they pay pretty close attention to those energy bills because They're variable.
I'll tell you what, they've been miserable in Florida.
They're not great. Yeah,
they're not great.
They're not great.
I got an email from my local utility a
Yeah.
couple weeks ago, and I saved it because I'm like, this is so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And it was basically communicating, we've established net zero goals for 2050.
Yeah.
Nothing is changing yet, but we are redoing our pricing.
Yeah.
And, their line was, your bill, the cost is not going up.
Right.
It's being restructured.
Right.
And so,
Crafty.
and so it was really interesting. I was like, okay, and for someone like me, I know the backstory, right? And I'm in on it. And it was still like, am I really going to pay $400 a month for my energy? You know what I mean? And that's the bottom line, right? Bottom line is that, okay, your off taker is going to pay X more for the same thing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, look, if you want to see Mrs. Romito divorce me, it's turn off the AC in Florida, right? That's not going to happen.
Right.
We are going to pay that.
Exactly.
Which means that cuts into our disposable income. And when you take into account just what's going on in the world with the cost of food, the cost of housing, the cost of literally everything, right? There is a breaking point where people just are like, I can't do it. I can't do it. So it's not just we have to do this. There's an economic reality that we just have to address and accept that the vast majority of just Joe Q public is going to reach a point where they're like, I don't care. Mm-hmm. And then when apathy actually sets in, then you have a real problem.
Right.
Because the problem is a problem.
Yes.
Right? It's just how you address it. But once you have this apathetic mindset sort of enter into the conversation, people are going to be like, I don't care.
Yeah.
I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to keep experiencing 20 to 30% increases in my bills every single year. That's just not a realistic expectation.
But to what you said earlier, the last time we had an infrastructure update was in the 60s.
Right.
And how does that affect our perspectives on power? Mm-hmm. Nuclear is a big example of that, right? It's got a PR problem. Bunch of talk about emotional storytelling with nuclear, right? And I think general audience doesn't understand nuclear power plants don't work today the way they did in the 60s, right?
Yeah. Renewables will increasingly become a greater proportion than they are today of the energy mix. They will become cheaper. They will become more efficient. With what's going on in energy storage, there will be a place for renewables. So first and foremost, what is critical is that investment needs to remain very disciplined with wind and solar. Because if investors keep losing their shirt and losing money on wind and solar, there's not going to be more investors, right? At some point, you have to offer an ROI. And I do think that will happen.
Yeah.
But, in the grand scheme of things, those technologies remain in their relative infancy. They have to be a component of the energy mix moving forward. It's just we have to assign very realistic expectations because people are putting up their own money and government money. There has to be an ROI. So that said, natural gas is clearly the solution. And I'll go back to what's going on in Virginia. 60% nat gas, 30% nuclear, 10 to 15% on any given day of renewable. 30% less than the national average, probably much more efficient and effective and reliable just because of all the economic activity going there. With what you see going on in Europe, natural gas seems to be a solution. Nuclear is clearly a solution. And, depending on what part of the world you are, it makes a ton of sense for solar and wind. I think the trick is, just as I said, getting those two technologies in a place where people are willing to pay for what it costs. Now, once again, over the course of time, it will become cheaper, become more reliable. But we can't position ourselves in a manner where we say, I want this to be the mix. Yeah. And you ask, well, why? Just because. That's not the way that the market works. You got to let the market act like the market. Yeah. So I think natural gas, nuclear clearly are going to lead the way. There's definitely a place for hydrogen, wind, and solar. We just have to be lovingly a little bit more patient with them.
And carbon capture.
Carbon capture, 100%. And then I would also say, don't dismiss coal in its entirety. American coal is a lot different animal than Indonesian coal or Chinese coal or even Australian coal. It would be a great opportunity for U.S. coal companies to export their coal to other countries. Now, once again, that is not saying we just keep coal
Right.
on in perpetuity. What that is acknowledging is there is an economic demand regardless of what the environmental argument is by countries, India, China,
Yep.
Southeast Asia, whatever it may be, who say, we just need coal. You have to take into account these nuances and all these regional differences into account. And then you have to understand that at the end of the day, it is a balance between emissions management and economics. You can't have 100% emissions management and 0% economics. You can't have the opposite, right? There has to be this optimal balance that you incorporate.
So you've given us a lot to think about today, and I really appreciate that. If you could summarize your 3 key takeaways, what would they be?
So number one, think that this is an energy expansion, not just an energy transition, meaning number one, the hydrocarbon industries were going to be critical for the global economy over the foreseeable future, which does not mean ignore renewables. It is an energy expansion. There is a place, and we need wind and solar technology to take off. The second component would be you can't have environmental stewardship without economic prosperity, right? You have to instill capital discipline. You have to allow these investments to provide an ROI. You can't, unfortunately, prioritize environmental stewardship over the economic law. And then the third component would be just remain intellectually honest about the energy mosaic. It's easy to go down the rabbit hole with any one particular technology. But as I said before, this is an energy expansion. And that requires taking into account geopolitical tensions, socioeconomic considerations, investor and capital markets expectations. Just like the energy solution is an all of the above set of solutions, the approach is an all of the above set of considerations as well. Like you just can't ignore one thing or the other.
Dan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It was great.
Thank you for joining us. This has been Lightbulb Moments, brought to you by Mitsubishi Power. You can keep the conversation going by following us on LinkedIn or on our website. Our guest today was Dan Romito from Pickering Energy Partners, and I'm Erin Bordelon. Be sure to check out our show notes for references and links that we used during today's episode. Thank you for joining us, Lightbulb Moments, bringing you the brightest minds, most engaging stories, and illuminating points of view from across the energy sector. We'll see you next time.